All right, thank you for being here in the afternoon section of the Indiana Organic Grain Farmer meeting. Just wanted to mention a couple of things before we get started. Have some sponsors that we'd like to recognize, both for the lunch and for sponsoring the two-day event. Great Harvest Organics was our sponsor for the lunch on both days. And we'd also like to thank Albert Lee Seed, Farm Power Implements, Shooter Oil Health Solutions, Alltech Crop Science, Grain Millers, Agri Energy Resources, and the Wolf Co-op for their sponsorship of this event. Now I'm happy to introduce Brian Koory. He's here from Mercaris to talk a little bit about an overview of the U.S. organic grain market, and we'll hear from a panel of grain buyers a little bit later. Here's Ryan.
Thank you much. Oh, that's the one I need. Thank you. Thank you all for sitting in on this. I appreciate it. I hope you all have lots of questions because the second half of this is supposed to be interactive, and I hope to have lots of good interactions. I'll apologize at the start of this presentation. The title of it's a little bit misleading. I will be doing a little bit of discussion about prices and about imports and acreage, but this isn't necessarily going to be an in-depth analysis of the organic industry overall. Really what we're going to do is we're going to talk about what's going on within the organic industry right now, mostly from like a supply perspective, in terms of how we see things like acreage and imports affecting what's going on within the U.S. organic industry, and maybe some of the misconceptions and maybe some of the things we need to start focusing on to promote some growth within U.S. acreage and to maybe diversify some of our demand situation. So, taking kind of a broad perspective of the supply situation in the United States for your two principal cash crops, corn and soybeans. We estimate that over 17-18, we harvested somewhere around 616,000 acres of corn and soybeans in the United States that were organic. Whereas we imported close to 800,000 acres of corn and soybeans, and that's including imported cracked corn and soybean meal. Well, if we look at where we are for 18-19, we actually increased those harvested acres by about 4%, which is pretty good. And we actually saw imports that are on the pace to decline, down about 1% year over year, which is pretty good. So on the face of it, those look like pretty good numbers. But there's some stuff going on behind those numbers that actually makes this a little more complicated than we're just growing more and importing less. And really what we're seeing is a shift in import preferences. So if we look at those two main crops again, if we look at corn and we look at soybeans, we can see that actually on the case of organic corn, we're decreasing our organic corn imports, and we've been decreasing them for several years in a row. We're on pace to be down to about 14.7 million bushels of imports this year, which is about 26% of U.S. supplies, which is a significant increase from 2015-16. Well, in contrast to that, if we look at what's going on with soybean and soybean meal, we can see that number is actually growing, and it's sustaining as a large share of our imports. We're our domestic supply. We're on pace to reach about 75% of our U.S. supply from imports. And again, that's including meal and whole beans, which is an important thing to consider because there's another demand dynamic that's shifting within that as well. So if we take that soybean import number and we split it down to meal and we split it into meal and beans, we can see that actually whole bean imports, they fell last year, and they're on pace to fall again this year, down 15%, down to their lowest level below 15-16 levels. Well, how can that be if we have imports continue to increase? We're pulling in more and more soybean meal. Well, that's an interesting thing. If we're needing more and more meal, why are we not importing more and more beans? Well, what it comes down to is, at the end of the day, we don't want to deal with beans in the United States. We need meal to feed animals, but we don't want to deal with beans. So why is it that we're seeing demand for beans fall off in the United States? It comes down to the soybean oil situation. And if we look at the pricing relationships, this is to highlight essentially what's going on with the markets. If we look at the conventional market, the meal to bean price ratio, we can see that on a pound-to-pound ratio, meal goes for about 90% of the price of a soybean. So that means of the value of that soybean that's getting bought, that goes back to the farmer, about 90% of that is actually bid into the bean, or bid into the meal. If we look at the organic sector, meal carries a much higher share of that. Well, that's because we're seeing meal go for something like 1050 short ton in the organic sector, which is a significant premium over conventional, because I think conventional is going for somewhere around 3 to 4 right now. But if you look at organic soybean oil, it's still going for 32 cents a pound. If you can sell it, you can get a premium, but a lot of it's actually getting dumped into the conventional market. So as a crush facility or as a soybean grower, you're not getting that value bid back into the bean or bid into your co-products. And so it's depressing the growth within that industry, and it's depressing the revenue within that industry. But I don't think that's necessarily the worst thing in the world for the organic, and I'll get to that in a second. If we look at how this is playing out in terms of farmer profitability, we can see that corn is really where the revenue is made. These are based on acres and yields for this year and prices through January of this year. We can see that so far organic corn has raised about $735 per acre above the conventional market, which is a pretty good return. You know, soybeans are actually doing better than they were last year, but it's still a significantly smaller share or a significantly smaller value than what we would get for the corn. And so at the end of the day, what we're seeing is essentially there isn't as much money to be made in soybeans versus corn. And so we're not seeing as many soybeans acres going in. Also, from an agronomic and a production perspective, it is harder to fit soybeans into our organic rotation. They don't fit as well, especially if you consider the fact that if you're trying to grow them for the nitrogen benefit for producing corn, there's a lot of crops that fit in there better. You could do alfalfa, come out better off than putting in soybeans into your rotation. And if you're making that much more money on your corn than you are soybeans, then it makes a lot of sense to forego those soybean acres, put in something else that's going to be more beneficial for your corn. And that's why we're seeing this gulf where we're continuing to close the import gap with corn, but we're seeing soybeans continue to persist. So really the question becomes then, okay, if we want to start talking about how do we fix that soybean import gap, what are the barriers, what are the potential solutions? I would argue that there really isn't a way to fix it by producing more domestic soybeans. Where the beans and the meal are coming in, they're not really located around key growing areas. We've seen down in the Gulf, we've seen a significant increase in whole bean imports. West Coast is pulling in lots and lots of meal that's largely going to dairy and poultry operations out there. You can see the East Coast is pulling in a significant amount of both. And in all these examples, you can see that meal continues to grow as a share. And again, it's that paradigm. We don't want to crush organic soybeans domestically. There's not enough economics in it. There's not enough return as a crush facility to really support those activities. So people are foregoing buying domestic meal and they're importing it. Looking again, this is just reiterating that previous point where our imports don't really align with where our crops are. You can see the majority of those soybean imports, they're California, they're Louisiana, actually, and even in that East Coast, it's largely in a Maryland, Delaware area, which you guys can guess what's going on there, versus where we're actually producing these crops, New York, but a lot of that's going to dairy. So that's not quite as big of a situation if you consider the proximity to Delaware and basically your primary chicken operations. But they're up here around the Great Lakes in the upper Midwest. It's your major organic producing areas. So the places that these things are being imported to really aren't where they're being demanded. So logistically speaking, it's not an easy thing to fix with domestic supply or with the domestic production. Oh. And then if we start thinking about it a little more broadly, well, within organics and organic soybeans in particular, we're on pace to import the equivalent of 665,000 acres of organic soybeans this year, which is a ton. It's a ton of organic acres. But if we think about this from a broader perspective of, okay, if we want to bring those acres home and produce those domestically, can we honestly fit another 665,000 acres of organic soybeans in the U.S.? I would argue not right now. If you do that, the impact that you're going to have on the production of these other rotational crops and small grain crops that you need to sustain an organic production system, it's going to exacerbate the situation you have now. So addressing this import situation, it's not necessarily an argument of how do we curtail the imports of organic soybeans, how do we foster the purchasing of domestic soybeans. Actually, I think really what the situation is, how do we curtail the import of organic soybeans and how do we foster the use of these other crops where these soybeans are being used? And that's primarily in animal feed rotation, or animal feed rations, going into poultry, largely poultry, and some into dairy as well. And so if we're looking at trying to close that gap, should we be making 885,000 acres of organic soybeans in the U.S.? I would argue no. What we need is some kind of conversation, some kind of shift in the way that we're looking at this market where we actually start to use a more complete rotation to fill that gap. One of those opportunities that I see to fill that, sunflower. I think in the U.S., organic sunflower has a huge opportunity. Over 18 marketing year, we imported the equivalent of about 41,000 acres of sunflower in the form of organic sunflower oil. We import a whole lot of organic sunflower oil, which is a little bit funny if you think about the soybean oil situation where you basically have to give it away at the conventional price. A lot of food operations would much rather use sunflower oil. It makes a better ingredient, I suppose. Quite frankly, I can't explain why, because I do numbers, I don't do baking. But apparently people would much rather use sunflower oil than they would rather use soybean oil. But one of the challenges that we have with substituting in sunflower for soybeans is you got to convince poultry producers to blend it in as a feed ration. And that's a hard conversation to have when sunflower comes in at 25 to 30% versus soybeans that are coming in at 45 to 48%. If you're trying to produce the most economically efficient and weight-gaining efficient feed ration, putting in a lot of sunflower, taking out soybeans doesn't make sense. But if you're trying to produce a feed ration that actually works with organic production methods and fits into the tenets of organic production, then I think there's a huge opportunity there for increased use of sunflower. But beyond trying to convince feed operations to feed more sunflower meal, we have a huge issue with where you're going to get it. Across the U.S., we did a survey recently, and we were able to identify 8 facilities crushing organic sunflower oil. And we may be undercounting by a few. If we're undercounting by 50%, that still means you have 12. That is not enough to foster any kind of acreage expansion in the U.S. If you look around the Indiana region, and if you guys actually know of a sunflower crushing facility here that we don't have on the map, I'm sorry, we did our best to find all of them. But even if there's only 1 or 2 that we missed out in Indiana, that's still woefully inadequate to foster sunflower production. So one of the questions that we look at is, how do we link these pieces of the system up? We know that a crop like sunflower could work well in organic rotation. We know that there's a huge import demand for the oil. We know that you can, to a degree, substitute out the meal for the soybean. So how do you link those things up and show the economic opportunity to start putting in facilities to crush it and to increase the demand for it? I don't know. It's a little chicken and egg, if you ask me. Another one is looking at small grains, but small grains are another challenge. If there's a fair amount that goes into the feed market, and those tend to bring a little bit better prices, but a lot of it's going into the food grade market. And one of the problems that we see with organic feed grade rather small grains is that they follow corn, just like food grade wheat does. It follows food grade corn. If corn is up, it tends to bring those up. If corn is down, it tends to bring those down, because what we see is they're opportunity-based feed rations. There are some operations that do specialty blends that avoid products like soy, that will actually go out and seek these things that are of a higher value and higher protein content to make those rations. But the majority of it, it's an opportunity blend and a cost opportunity blend against corn. And so that means corn ultimately drives these prices. Well, if we want to start bidding more profitability into the organic rotation, and we want to start fostering some of that expansion, that should lead to some divergence of these prices and start bidding more premiums into them. However, again, it's one of those chicken and egg situations. How do you get the market to go to a place that it's not at naturally? How do you change the conversation and the mindset to where we start thinking about integrating the whole rotation into these demand situations and not just trying to go with whatever we can find in our own backyard? And then closing remarks on the other major opportunity I think we have for expansion. It's in marketing basically your beans, peas, lentils, things like that. And I think this is another one of those situations. If we look at from a feed ration perspective, this is a good protein opportunity in your feed ration, but it's just not the norm. A lot of operations that are smaller, that are more based at home, farmers who are feeding on farm or who have a livestock, they are actually doing a better job of putting these things into the rotation because they don't have to market it to the East Coast or to California or down to the Gulf. They're able to use it at home. But the problem is, that's not what's driving imports. It's the growth in the Gulf, growth on the coast that's driving imports. So if we want to start pushing some growth in this to eat at some of that import growth there, we have to change the preferences in those regions as well, not just on our farm. And believe that's everything I have to say for this morning, or afternoon now.
So I know there are some places that have done, or maybe they're preparing for, from a marketing point of view, to push this sort of awareness to the consumer that such and such buying practices, if you buy this product, this is using a diverse crop, and we know we need a diverse crop, and all of that sort of thing. Is that the kind of thing you're talking about? I mean, you're assuming you're talking about consumer-driven demand when you say, what can we do, what conversation, or is that what you mean when you're asking that question?
I guess it depends on at what point you want to call the consumer. So I think for many organic farmers, the consumer isn't the grocery store consumer. It is the feed operation, or it is the mill, or whoever it is that's buying the grain. I think some of changing their perspective comes from changing the preferences in what the end consumer, the grocery store consumer, is looking for, and translating what it means to be organic to those consumers, so that I think part of what you're seeing is these larger producers, livestock producers, know that organic is a growth market. And so within the United States, we're not really eating any more food. If you want to grow as a company, you have to take market share from somebody else. And the place of growing market share is value-added food items like organic. And they know this. And so they're going after organic as a way of growing their market share. Well, if all they're going after organic is the way of growing market share, then they're going to do it in the most economically efficient way possible. They're not going to do it because it's supporting organic. And quite frankly, we can't really expect them to, because they're large corporations that are out to be efficient. That's their job. Not to speak ill or to say that it's good or bad, it's just what they do. So some of it comes from changing the perspective of the end point, the grocery store consumer, so that they put pressure on these larger operations in terms of what they're selling and what they're buying, what they're marketing. But I think some of it also comes from the bottom up, with farmers working with their co-ops or working, with the OTA. I know OTA has had some bad press recently based on some of their policy adoption, but they're still one of the strongest lobbying arms we have as a group, working with these people from the bottom up and putting lobbying pressure and trying to change the way that these people are working so that they are operating in a way that is consistent with organic agriculture overall.
Yeah, but the whole movement, though, no, I shouldn't say the whole movement. I don't know how to say the whole movement, but this seems like mostly a consumer-driven thing. And so to say what to do in a year or two is different from what do you do in 5 years, so that you're kind of magnifying that mindset or amplifying that mindset in the general public. As the millennials get older, take more responsibility for the market, you say, well, this is part of it. This is that holistic thing that
Sure.
we all know we've already started going this holistic way, and part of that holistic consideration is that we need a diverse agriculture. And so this supplier gets this designation, as a regenerative, whatever,
Right.
versus this guy who is just organic.
I think what it means I think one way of addressing that is, first of all, organic has to mean something. And that's hard because within agriculture, you can't say you have to do it X way because X way is best, because everybody's farm is in a different area with a different soil, different logistics situations. You have to have flexibility within that allows people to be efficient. So how do you make something that means something that's concrete and translatable, but is also flexible enough to be efficient and applicable across the whole United States? So that's challenging on that side. However, it's important for it to mean something, because once it means something, then that can become a message that you can go out there and you can communicate to the public. And I think part of why we're not seeing that pressure coming from the consumer side top down is that the message of organic isn't fully being translated to consumers. They understand it as, I don't think most consumers understand it much farther than they understand non-GMO. I don't think that they understand that there are other issues in terms of soil integrity, in terms of regional sustainability, in terms of all these other positive aspects that are supposed to be what organic stands for. I don't think those things are getting translated to the end consumer. So when the end consumer goes to the store and buys a pound of chicken breast, they're not looking for organic because they feel like organic has this whole bundle of benefits. They have an understanding that, yes, it uses less pesticides and there's no genetic modification in it, and that's good. And so from buying a feed perspective, does it really matter if they're buying stuff that's being imported so long as it's still the same thing?
Right.
Not really, because that's not what they're buying.
But
So,
but that's where they are now.
right,
And that's what marketing is for. That's
Right,
why you pay $1
absolutely.
million to, or $1 billion, whatever. But it seems like the country is headed. You know, we're ready for this. We're ready for a
Sure.
more sophisticated understanding of the food system. And so it seems like it's a decent time to go ahead and start paying somebody for these, for the.
I would absolutely agree. I think that's when one of the underdeveloped sides of organic is the marketing side, and I think that's going to be important going forward. I would like to bring up the panel now before I eat up too much time. If you guys could come on up.
I'm going to a much less big picture question, but anyway, I see these kind of presentations about the large volume of organic grains coming into the United States, and with a background in commodity grain production, America is where we send grain to the world.
Right.
So where is this coming from? What country is more organic than us so that they're exporting?
Well, there's a little bit of a hat trick occurring here. What happens, and I can't speak for everything, but I know in many situations, so with organic, there's a lot of countries who have a leg up on us for going organic because they haven't been farming the way we have for the past 30 years. Take India, for example. We import a lot of meal from India because it is de facto organic. That's just how they've been producing it. So they can go very quickly, apply for a license, and now it's organic, and now they're getting a premium. They don't care that they're not selling the oil for a premium. They weren't selling it for a premium before. Now they can sell the meal for a premium. So why wouldn't they? You look at Latin America, there's a lot of places there. There's been a pretty high adoption rate of GMO technology there, but there's a lot of places that haven't. That land is de facto organic. Same thing within the Black Sea region. That land is de facto organic. It's just waiting for a certification, and now you can sell it at 2 to 3 times what you're selling it before. And so that's part of why that situation's occurring. The other part of it is the broken demand side, the issues that I was discussing, in which we're importing stuff that we can't fit into an organic rotation here because we're demanding stuff that doesn't fit into an organic rotation. And so we need to change how we're demanding these feed ingredients so that they do fit into an organic rotation. So these other countries, they're being opportunistic. They see the chance to take what they were selling for this price and just apply it for some paperwork and make a lot more money. So the solution really comes from within the U.S., not necessarily fighting imports. There's probably some argument to be had for fraudulent imports and people doing some shady activity. Yeah. But to be completely honest, I think that's fringe. I don't think that's the majority of it. Speaking with these companies that are importing this stuff, if they're capable of, they will go to lengths to avoid it because it's not good for them. It tarnishes their brand. And what they want is their brand to be good. So even if there is fraudulent, that's on the fringe. It's the core of why are we importing this stuff? Why are we demanding it? That needs to be addressed. Not necessarily, how do we prevent people from coming into our market? I don't think that that's a correct way of solving it because, like I said, can we really fit another 660,000 acres of organic soybeans in the U.S.? No. So, well, okay, then where are you going to get it from?
I guess I have trouble understanding why that is possible.
I would say it's possible, but the problem is then you're also making more rye, more spelt, more wheat, more everything else. And if you take where it is and not where you want organic to be, there just isn't enough market out there right now to soak up all of those organic grains. It will depress the premiums and the prices you're getting for organic commodities even more. And so instead of trying to add these acres and adding to U.S. supply, I think the solution is, well, why don't we take the stuff we're already making instead of trying to add more to it and close that supply gap? Because that will bring up those prices and it will bring that system together and it will help benefit farmers and make it more holistic.
Is there other things besides meal that we can deal with? It seemed like your whole thing was on crushed meal.
Yes, because that's the vast majority of our imports.
It is. And not just regular meat. It comes in as meal, not as soybean.
Well, actually, it used to be mostly soybeans, then it started being soybean meal, and on this year we're on track to eclipse beans with meal. So yeah, beans have been falling for the past 2 years, and meal is now bigger than beans.
I guess I struggle with getting my head around that.
It's because domestic crushing facilities can't make very good returns off of crushing soybeans because there is no market for organic soybean oil.
So you're saying that they don't want to push the organic meal as compared to buying imports, it's probably going to be cheaper.
Well, imports are cheaper for sure. But
So there's a money, I guess I look at it as there's a money issue there.
there is.
That they can make more, they're gonna make more by buying imports instead of.
My
buying-
counter argument to that is look at what's happened with corn. Imported corn has always been cheaper than domestic corn, and yet we're closing that gap. So there's an element to it that's more than just the price differential. There's a fundamental economics of how the market's operating that's causing that gap to grow. And that has to do with how we're demanding stuff and what we're willing to produce domestically, and we can't produce within an organic system.
I guess I kinda keep coming back to, why don't we put on the label, that this is USA made products? And I
That's
hear
an approach, for
I
sure.
hear all the argument, oh, it costs too much money to change the box, and all that. I'm thinking, every time they come out with a new box, a new logo on a box, that they can change that pretty fast, as far as I'm concerned.
I think that's one of many potential solutions. I think that you have to be a little bit careful with that tack because that does put a cost on somebody within the supply chain. And it gets complicated. I know that much to be true. That's not an area that I really specialize in terms of like crafting what's the optimal policy for solving this type of a situation. I think that's one of the potential tools, but honestly, I don't know all the ramifications and counter arguments against it. I would agree that that's one potential tool.
I think the marketing of non-GMO has tarnished the organic label, thinking that if you're non-GMO, you're as close to being, it's almost as good as being organic. And I don't think the public understands the difference between a non-GMO and an organic product. Organic product has a certain standard.
Sure,
Non-GMO can be
sure.
most anything.
And I would say that I agree that, I don't agree that non-GMO hurts organic directly. I think
It does at the end, as far as.
Well,
buyers.
absolutely, absolutely. I think that it is another method within the United States that we could produce crops better. I think if non-GMO hurts organic on the consumer end, that's our fault because we're not communicating what organic is. If consumers go to the store and they don't understand the difference between organic and non-GMO, that's not their fault, that's our fault.
Is it the fault of organics, or is it a fault of the marketing people that this is an avenue that they can still,
Well, for the
not have to pay the organic price?
for the marketing people to care, somebody has to pay them to care. And for somebody to pay them to care, they have to care that the marketing people are getting paid. So it comes from the ground up, to be completely honest.
If it's not good enough to put on the label, or the table, it's not good enough to put on the label, I guess, is what I come down to.
I think building brand recognition and educating consumers on the whole basket of benefits of organic is an important component of fixing that. Because without that understanding, you're never going to change that mindset that's going to change how we're demanding these inputs.
This is maybe not, I know the organic checkoff is a divisive issue, and not mean to bring that up, but I mean, that's the role that a checkoff would generally play.
Right.
And so the checkoff got largely just shot down by farmers who didn't want to be able to put money into those coffers, and so, which makes sense, that's a valid point. But what the OTA has done is they now have a GROW 2.0, GRO, which is it's a checkoff-like program. They're not calling it a checkoff program. And largely what it is it's industry, it's food companies that are giving money to this program, and then the OTA with some kind of feedback decides where that goes. The reason I bring this up is that they just committed, I want to say it was $1 million to a group called Organic Voices. And what they're going to be doing is thinking more creatively about the messaging and righting some of the wrongs. I think you're absolutely right. I think that there's been an inadequate education to be able to differentiate non-GMO from organic. So they're trying to start doing that, and as you say, you have to pay the marketers, so there had to be $1 million from
Right.
a collective of food companies to even bring that as an issue worth funding.
I guess I have trouble with the OTA's checkoff, because what I could read into it is most of the ones who are controlling the money are big corporation companies and not farm people, ag they're the next level of people that I could see that was gonna control the money, you know. That's what bothered me on the OTA.
I'm with you. I don't think that's a valid point.
I add another
Yeah.
thought from a farmer standpoint. A lot of guys like me have a bad taste in their mouths over the corn and soybean checkoff.
Yeah.
I donate more money to the soybean checkoff than I do my church. And all I can tell that they do is give me junk mail and soybean candles or something.
Yeah, no, I mean,
Who cares?
I think in a lot of ways it's like government, right? We need government, but we need government that works. Government for government's sake isn't effective. And so how do you make sure you have the checks and balances that make sure that these organizations are promoting the things that are important? I'm just a lowly economist. I look at numbers all day. I don't know how you do that. But I do think that thinking about these things and coming up with these answers is a very important part of where organic's going to be 5-10 years from now.
I don't like paying my soybean check off to a company that I'm gonna get this fancy, glossy magazine
Yeah.
that's promoting Monsanto's products and GMO.
Well, as organic producers, you guys pay into the conventional checkoff, right?
I know that.
And that's absolutely wrong. You guys should not, it's not your market. You guys don't, it's arbitrary to you guys. Why would you pay into that checkoff? It's not fair to you
Because
guys.
it's a federal thing and we can't get out of it. I mean, that really
Right.
bothers me.
Yeah. No, and I don't disagree with that. I think that's 100% correct. I think it's wrong for organic producers to pay into a conventional checkoff. It's not,
Especially
they're not
without
supporting your
having-
market.
Especially without having a voice
Yeah,
from our market.
right. Yeah.
I mean, as soon as it says organic, I should be exempt from the checkoff,
Yeah, I would agree with that.
that part. But that, I mean, that's just my personal stinky bone.
If I can get my reluctant panel members to come up here and join me in the firing squad, I'd appreciate it.
Throw 'em to the wolves.
My
Good,
anger
there
from
was a
soybean
target
checkoff.
in your head.
Just as a follow-up to that, so are you guys aware of the Organic Farmers Association? So it's kind of made it your rebuttal, and so it seems like the issue is the governance structure, right? So the OTA, I don't think you're wrong, so the governance structure to make sure that farmer voices were actually represented and heard among the OTA and how they funded, that was a big issue, and that was not thought through nearly enough. But I think the OFA theoretically,
That's not all.
It's
just for the recording.
actually recording
I
back
think,
there.
yeah. I think that with some more dollars, I think that would be hopefully kind of a mouthpiece for a representative democracy.
I mean, I look at all the members of the OTA, and there's companies on there that's like, these people are shady.
Yeah.
I just can't, it just makes the hair come up on my neck.
I hear you. Yeah.
You know, I think one potential solution to this situation is, as I was mentioning before, I think what we need to do is figure out how to relocalize where we're demanding it. Because we're never really going to fix this import situation by trying to battle what's going on the East Coast, West Coast, and Louisiana. If we can, through the development of more and better co-ops and through regional partners, and if you're listening to Thor's discussion of doing on-farm value add and finding people within your community, I think that's probably a more productive way of doing this. Because say you have 200 acres of organic farm, well, you can sit there and you can control if you're running cattle or if you've got chicken or whatever, and you can control what you're growing and what's going into that feed ration, and you can value add and control your demand perspective there, bringing that demand back into a local perspective. And I think that's probably a benefit that could be marketed through organic, is that it is a more local solution to a lot of things, or at least it can be.
I agree with you on that, but it takes a lot of work. I mean, organics is a small market compared
Sure.
to everything else, and value added is even really tiny. I mean,
Right.
We're getting down to minute amounts.
You're
It
right.
takes a lot of work to find that market,
Yeah, no, you're right.
if you want to do that.
But you know, that's where the opportunities are, right? The easy stuff's already done, and the industry's kind of getting away from the people who are actually on the ground doing it. So if we're going to change the direction of that ship, it's going to be some hard on the ground stuff.
Is there, on that same subject, if we can spend a little more time on that, is there an opportunity, I know what's going on kind of in the hemp world, and there's some real concern about the hemp, distribution, just the whole system basically going the way of big ag, big food, and all that. And so there are people who are putting some real thought into how do we want to structure this so that it kind of doesn't get there in the first place. And so it seems like some of that kind of evaluative or intellect would speak well into this thing we're talking about, even though we're talking about doing it after the fact and they're talking about it
Right.
from the ground up.
Any of you guys have any opinions on hemp markets? I honestly have not spent hardly any time looking at them yet, to be completely honest.
It's too soon for Indiana, but it's almost not.
Sure, so not specific to hemp, but in this general conversation, I'm a believer in free markets and efficient markets, and I think it's important to think about why people want and why people grow organics. Part of that is to have a better earth, to not abuse our earth. And there was a time that I was averse to imported organics. At first I thought, oh, hey, I don't know about this. But why should we say that a political border should capture and keep all of this here? If there's other countries that are supporting farms and businesses with organic production, it's up to us to be more efficient and be more competitive, regardless of what that looks like. And if the goal is to have Earth in better shape than it is today in 30, 50, 100 years, I think it's short-sighted for us to think about keeping that all in the U.S. and trying to block out other countries, because it's a matter of time when the Chinese or the next country that's rising up wants to buy organics in a large way, and maybe in a generation we're a net exporter. So I think we need to be really careful about just trying to close that up and keep it for ourselves.
I want to clarify on the hemp thing. I wasn't talking about import or export. I meant even just within the states. But but I think what you're raising there is a really interesting question. I think we've had a standard answer for that for the last maybe 40 years, and I think maybe we're wondering now whether that line of reasoning, is how far that goes. I understand what you're saying, but and I've heard that, and I've said it myself, but I was in the automotive industry back in the 80s too, and we said the same kind of things. And what it seems like oftentimes happened is with these global scales of production, what you do is you increase the likelihood that huge mass is going to go someplace and wreck it. And you didn't even mean to. You didn't mean to destroy the rainforest, But because we had a global scale of demand and market, there was so much pressure financially they couldn't see any other way. And so there's an argument for the small is beautiful, arguments from the 70s.
Mm-hmm. I guess I'm looking at, I will compete with imports on an equal basis. I don't want to compete with fraudulent imports.
Absolutely.
I don't want that at all.
Yep.
I mean, I don't want somebody sending cars in to the U.S. that don't meet the safety standards that are set forth here and sell them cheaper. I mean, we have to kind of stay at the same base level. I guess, introduce yourself, because I don't know who you are.
Yeah, my name's Wyatt Muse, and I operate a farm in Illinois, trade cash grains with McDonald Pells. I've spent about 15 years in the grain business, mostly focused on food grade and IP crops.
Anders Gerda, Pipeline Foods, formerly of O-Grain, do a lot of education, transition consulting, a little bit of kind of merchandising light as well.
Matt Mosier with the Andersons. I'm a grain buyer, focusing mainly on organic and specialty soybeans, wheat, and small grains.
So just to kind of get to your points about, I think if I heard your argument right, it's in defense in a way of the fact that we live in a global economy, and that we shouldn't be so quick to have a protectionist viewpoint, right? And I think that in organics we have been able to enjoy an insulation that has been kind of a self-contained and self-sustaining market, right? And so I think about the trade wars that we're experiencing right now. And one of a good sales point, a sales pitch to someone who's conventional, who's thinking about organic is, are you hurting it all on your soybean prices right now? Well, there is a market where you can grow food that is completely insulated and completely untouched by any of these tariffs, right? And so the fact that we are export dependent, or import dependent, rather not exporting, I think that is something that is the time, the time is maybe limited in that way. And so thinking about a global economy, this is maybe too far of an argument, but we think about really supporting the American farmer and thinking about supporting the smallholder, maybe a small family farm. And we would like to be able to typify all these other foreign farmers as large corporate interests somewhere in the Black Sea, and that's true. That does exist. Argentina has huge farms. We work with some of them, but we had two of our Pipeline Foods members went down to India to be able to kind of source out that supply chain. Because full disclosure, we as a company import grain. Right? We have operations in Argentina. We have an elevator in Argentina. But in all those countries, we know all the growers that we source from, and we have boots on the ground, and we know every single part of the supply chain, and we have people who are third-party verifying at every element where the grain gets moved, right? So we have full transparency through to be able to protect against, fraudulent imports. And these Indian farmers, the average size was, I think, 5 or 6 acres. So there's thousands and thousands of these smallholders that are growing soybeans kind of on a hand scale, making good money, making better money than they ever made. They can afford a moped, their kids go to school, right? So just kind of an argument for farmers everywhere as opposed to only farmers here.
And the argument of small is beautiful, I think that's correct in the sense that part of what we're trying to do with this is sustain local economies and sustain local farms, and I think that's important. But if we take that concept and we try to make it writ large across the United States, the OTA came with their numbers for 2017 where organic sales reached $54 billion or something like that, which is great. U.S. food sales was $7 trillion that year. So if you want to take that small is beautiful concept and push it across the United States and bring it to all farmers across the U.S., there's a lot of work to be done, and that work is going to require the cooperation of large producers. And so part of it is changing their mindset, and I think that comes through changing consumer preferences, but also part of it is internalizing that market on the farm or close to the farm so that you're not so dependent on them to grow your market share. And so I think that small is beautiful is important, but we need to think about how do we take that beyond our farm and how do we work to support the industry in a way that pushes it across the United States?
Yeah, I think that the two arguments, whether it's global or national, I think they're very similar.
Mm-hmm.
It's that distributed, it's that distributed small sourcing, and I don't mean that in a technical way, but I mean ultimately that is what we're talking about. How do you get value of a particular area and the diversity, the robustness, the resilience, all of those words. And I think there's a shift going on now, more towards that, as opposed to what you might call the free market or neocon argument, for the last, 50 years. Just because certain things, like always, we learn from them. And I say, be careful of the philosophy. It's usually all of them are a little bit of a simplification of what's really, what really happens. It's fascinating. I love it.
So we're gonna have an auction here. Corn
I will say, just from the kind of the consumer perspective, so Michigan State puts out a consumer survey biannually, twice a year, and the last one that they put out, they looked and said, ask consumers, what do you want to see on the bag? What do you want to see on the label? More than organic, more than non-GMO, they chose the word natural. Just the word natural. So and what that shows is the consumer does not understand, and they don't have the capacity to. So we are way far away from the consumer being able to understand what is even non-GMO or organic.
Absolutely don't understand. I'll be in the grocery store and the woman next to me is like, well, it says it's organic, but is it non-GMO? I don't want any GMOs in my food.
Yeah, absolutely. And also one of the other hats I wear at the Andersons is I run our direct-to-consumer e-commerce sales. So we on Amazon, sell our spelt flour, and so then I get to answer all the questions that come along with that, and we sell both organic and non-organic. And if I had $1 for every time somebody on Amazon asked me what the difference was, I'd be a rich man, because consumers just don't understand.
So what do you tell them?
Well, then I explain the differences between organic and non-GMO, because we do have the non-GMO label on both bags, and then of course we have the organic on what's organic. So I explain the differences, and I don't know exactly, because you're not direct face with them, whether or not they actually understand, or whether or not that they will, next time they make a purchase, kind of follow through on that. So it's really hard to gauge where they're at. But just from the question, I can understand where they're starting from, and it's a long way from being kind of where we have solutions, at least on the consumer level.
Well, the natural label has such a broad spectrum of, it could be anything.
Absolutely.
Natural means
Yep.
whatever.
It's not, if you call it a label, that's.
It could be the
that's
chickens
not
in the
even that. Yeah, it's
backyard,
just a
but they're
word.
getting fed GMO
Yeah.
grains, or, or the
Natural
wheat.
can be anything, it's too big.
Yep, absolutely. I mean, and I just bring that up just from the survey of we actually don't put that on our bags. Maybe we should apparently. But it just really just kind of understand what the consumer mindset is. And it kind of, even just from our perspective as grain buyers and companies, there's a lot that we can do, and I think everybody has their part to play in this. But if everybody's not pulling their weight, I think on the consumer side, it's going to be a long way for them to. We can do what we can on the testing side, farmers can do what they can on their side, but at the end of the day, if not all three parties are kind of pulling the same wagon, to make it kind of difficult.
So how do you encourage awareness of what the organic label is compared to the natural or the non-GMO label? How do you get that out to the public for them, the consumer, it all comes down to the consumer is buying or not
Yeah.
buying this one or this.
Well, that was one of the main goals when the organic checkoff was first proposed, I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago, when Tom Vilsack signed that. The idea was you put signage at the grocery store, put it up so that anyone that's walking in to buy says USDA organic means this, this, and this, not that. And so I think you just got to put it in front of people.
So I think in the end, it's because there is no checkoff, because there is no kind of larger governing or outreach body, the responsibility ends up falling to each individual company. And so I've seen companies really increasingly calling out non-GMOs, Organic Valley, in all of their kind of what we are now. It says never GMO, right? And so I think that the companies in large part are having to, not even that they want to, they have to be able to protect their own label. And so they're taking it upon themselves to do the consumer education, which means that it's inconsistent at best, right? So there is no kind of larger way to say this. And Matt, you were talking about kind of, all three parts or parties kind of pulling together. I think the thing to realize about this panel, right, is that we are kind of one tier, one strata of what we're talking about, and we actually really have minimal power to be able to your conversation, your
Right.
presentation, to be able to inform what markets are available or are not available. We all, serve at the pleasure of those who we sell to, and so really who should be here would be General Mills and Purdue and, the companies who are actually, they need to have the guy who's mixing the TMR here and the person who is thinking about what kind of ancient grains are going into their power bars here, Like those are the people who actually drive. I think there's oftentimes a misconception that we as buyers can make the decision just to start buying 4 times as much oats as we do, and I wish it worked that way. That would be awesome.
But you at least do see that, some of those conversations.
Yeah, visibility.
We've seen some of the changes, because I think what we're talking about, and that's one of the most, I'm talking an awful lot, I'm sorry, this is my last thing.
Oh, don't do that.
None
Keep
of
talking.
None of these things are static, right? Sometimes we talk about how are things now? Well,
Sure.
the way things are now is very different than they were 10 years ago, And so our goal, our hope is to get things very different in 10 years from now. Right now, we've made that 10 to 15%, intrusion into the market. It seems like it's huge, but it's really only 10 to 15%, is my understanding, just like craft beer. So our goal is to get closer to that tipping point, call it 18% or whatever, whoever wants to call it, whatever number, but, we're going for that next level of general awareness of how a food system works. And somebody will, apparently not you guys, will come up with the term.
We'll be a part of it.
That makes sense to the consumer.
Well, I know,
Which lower, less sophisticated sophisticated questions, I guess, for the grain buyer panel, but before we run out of time, as somebody who's relatively new to raising organic grains, as far as quality, accountability, grain bins, trucks, what are you looking for in when you decide to make that purchase?
It's a good question. And so actually, I'm not so much a buyer as Emily is. So maybe Emily, the pipeline has the question we can toss on.
Definitely doing the best job you can do to grow that grain. So definitely just making sure the grain's clean, that it's quality grain. I think someone was talking about it earlier, just, when you're milling something or you're processing something, you want it to come out like you would expect it to when you process. So I think quality is number one. And then also, good communication and working with your buyer. And I mean, that's always important too, but definitely quality I think is very important.
I think just the communication, letting us know what you have, right? So we have our stated bids, we know what we're having an open sale for, but if we don't know what you have, if a sale comes on, then we can't operate. We can't connect you to be able to kind of create a market for you. And in terms of what you know in quality, we do free testing at our facility. So if you want to know what you have, send us a pound bag and we can get it tested for you so you know what you're looking at in terms of our pay price, what part of our bid you're looking at, and kind of where you stand in relation to other folks as well.
Yeah, I'll agree with all that and just kind of reiterate on communication. And then as you kind of go down this path of finding a partner that you really want to develop a long-term relationship with, and because as you go organic, mentioned this yesterday, you're going to get a lot of phone calls because your number's going to be out there, and there's a lot of really small brokers out there that really maybe aren't vetted or maybe aren't really aligned with what your business is. So trying to find a partner and somebody who is willing to work with you, who will test a sample out, who has facilities, who has basically a business model that yours fits into, that has the same values. And I think overall, when you develop a partnership, that's really what's going to help your business grow, and then whoever you choose to go and grow along with it.
Yeah, I think these guys nailed it, but also look at what kind of market you're growing for. I mean, if you're next door to a feed mill, that's probably going to be a good opportunity. If you're looking to go to food grade markets, you're probably going to want to invest in belt conveyors and maybe some modifications on your combine and maybe have the ability to screen some grain on farm. So I think Matt nailed it with saying, align yourself with where your market's going to be and who your buyer's going to be. But there's a long way you can go for quality. I mean, you saw some of the presentations earlier, and there's a lot of things that can be done.
My suggestion, start out with feed and get that mastered, and then slide in, if you want to, slide into the food market, if you can.
Yeah.
Feed has a lot broader range of standards. Food grade, the standards get pretty narrow. They really pinch down to a whole different ballgame.
And so there's kind of, you can wander into that, right? So a lot of us do food and feed, and so you can get feed, and then you can shoot for food spec if you don't meet food spec, because it is a it's a shorter, more kind of limiting set of specs. Then we can also have the feed. I'll share this in terms of general strategy. Will Glazik, actually buddy of Wyatt's and ours, he has this idea of a pyramid, right? And so to your point, that the majority of your grain by volume should probably go to feed. It's easier to grow, it takes a little bit less energy. Seed selection is as important. You're not watching the diseases maybe as carefully and as anxiety producing as you are with food. And then the next tier would be food, so you can gather a little bit more premium potentially for your increased management of that food. And then the top tier, where sugar would be in a dietary pyramid, right? So a little bit would be your relationship marketing, direct marketing, distilleries, local mills, and that you have to be, that's years down the line when you really have your system dialed in. But as a grain buyer, we probably shouldn't advocate selling into other markets, but in terms of diversifying where you're selling and where you're getting your income streams from, that is, I think, a pretty viable long-term solution.
Explain where do you guys, I'm going to ask you, how do you guys establish your market, your price base that you're starting out with? Where do you gauge yourself off of market?
So it's competitive. I mean, all markets are competitive, and if it's a feed buyer, they want the lowest cost, period. If it's a food buyer, they're less concerned about cost and more on quality. But it's competitive. And as more acres have come online, what was it, 600,000 or so harvested last year, buyers have a lot of choice. So it's an efficient market, and you know, I think about pricing, and I've seen a low. I paid $4.50 a bushel once for organic corn in 2009. That was about 75 cents over futures, give or take. You know, there was really no premium. It was at the, you know, into the recession, kind of. It was a rough time. And then in 2013, paid $19 for a bushel of corn because it was following a drought, and the guy held on to it. And so I don't think anyone here or anyone in this room is able to set prices. I mean, anyone can put out a bid or an offer at whatever they would like to achieve, but ultimately it takes two, and so I don't think there's anyone that that can set that market. Now Mercaris does a nice job with price reporting, and so you know, you can have some anonymous you know, input and share pricing, and that gives a general idea. But kind of like what Matt said earlier, with you know, everyone's in a database and the names are out there. So if you know, if you've been buying from someone, you think their price is too high, there's a couple thousand names that you can call and find it cheaper.
So we're going to have to wrap up this session. It's just about 2:30. These clocks are slow. So thank you to our panelists and to Ryan.